I want to now come back in 39 to 41, and I want to go to the training section for Joseph. Remember, in Joseph's life, we jumped over to Judah because Judah sold Joseph. But we left off at the end of chapter 37, having dealt with some aspect of the training time for Joseph. And in 39, we get into the testing, and the testing rolls forward into the triumph. So let's just take a moment and take a look at 39:1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. There are a couple of lessons that Joe is going to learn, and these lessons are shocking to him. I want you to think for a moment what it means to be the favored son of your father, then cast into a hole by your brothers, sold right in front of your brothers. As you're standing there crying, you're being carted off as a slave, and you end up being sold in a slave market, and you have no idea what just happened. If Joseph had a problem, it was naivety. Guess what? He had a rude awakening. The people he was talking to and growing up with and telling his dreams to just sold him into slavery. I don't even know if I could think that way. I don't know if I could think that the people who were closest to me in life could openly betray me. That's not someplace I can put myself. So one of the lessons he's going to learn is in 39:1. Lesson number 1 for the training program for Joseph is, anywhere you go, I'm with you. Anywhere you go, I'm with you. Even when you can't understand what you're doing there, I know, because I'm working a plan in you and for you. Anywhere you go, I'm with you. It's interesting. There's a passive tone in verse 1. I don't know if you catch it. He had been taken down, and he was bought. He goes from being the person who walks around saying, you're all going to bow down to me, to having all of his life movements determined for him. He was taken. He was bought. The passive verbs tell you that something dramatic has happened in Joseph. This is a kid whose bubble popped. And he's walking around, and he was from a classic dysfunctional family. He had, all these stepmothers and stepbrothers and all this tension going on in his home. One minute he's a 17-year-old boy with all of his life ahead of him, and then the next moment he's a slave living a life of drudgery. And you gotta wonder how that feels and what kind of exchange goes on there. I want you to also notice that when you're reading verses 2 through 6, God is not only with us when things are working out. That's an important principle, verses 2 through 6. God is not only with you when things are working out. And I say that because, look at verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. That's the capturing idea. How do I know that I'm not way off the rails saying that God is teaching him, I'm with you? Because the text says the Lord was with him. Now, I want to ask you a question. Did it feel like the Lord was with him? Does it matter if you feel like the Lord is with you? No. It doesn't matter how you feel about it. It matters that he is there and he is at work. And he's at work when you don't think he's there, and you don't think he's at work, and you can't imagine how this circumstance is going to work out to your good. I want you to remember, when Romans says all things work together for good, it means his good, not yours. Now, wait a minute. His good, which is ultimately your best good. But in the short term, this side of heaven, it may not work out for you at all. Otherwise, God owes an apology to martyrs. Okay? So the reality is that it may not work out until long after you're dead. Here's what I know. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. Okay, wait a minute. I got to tell you, I'd rather be a reasonable failure-free man than a successful slave. Am I wrong here? I mean, I'm thinking being a successful slave does not capture me as a life plan. What I'd really like to do is be the most successful slave. Here's what it says. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him. So not only was the Lord with him in verse 2, I underlined in my Bible, the Lord was with him. And then in verse 3, the master saw the Lord was with him. So what is the text about? It's about how the Lord was with him. That's what it's about. And how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. Look at verse 5. It came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. There it is, a third time. The Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. The Lord blessed the house because he was there, as in the Lord was with him. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned. A fourth time, the Lord blessed in the house and in the field. Go all the way down to verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. I'm skipping this story for just a minute. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. Now he's not only the best of the slaves, he's the highest ranking prisoner. And the chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made him prosper. Wait a minute, Pastor. You got to be saying at this point, things are working out for Joseph. I mean, this is really working out. But you got to remember, being the top of the ladder of slaves and moving to the top of the ladder of prison is not anyone's favored life plan. Success is a relative thing. I'll grant you that he was pretty successful considering he was a prisoner. But let's be honest. God's presence neither exempted him from trials nor guarded him against the lies of the enemy's accusations. Wait a minute. We all heard that? He's walking with God, and that doesn't exempt him from being lied about and thrown in prison. He's walking with God, and that doesn't exempt him from being thrown in a hole and being sold as a slave. So what exactly gives us the idea that because we're walking with God, we have some protective shield that no weapon formed against us will prosper? One of the most misused verses in the Bible. Does that mean that no weapon formed against? What happened to Joe? So obviously something's wrong here, because this guy's looking like something was formed against him and a lie was formed against him, and he ended up stuck in a hole. He ended up stuck in a prison. I'm thinking there's some weapons working pretty hard. If no weapon formed against me will prosper will mean that I will have no trouble in my life, then Job needs to be ripped out of the book. Okay? That's not what that means. And you have to wait for what it does mean, because we'll get there. Here's what I know. Where was God if God was so present? Here's my answer. He was at work. What looks like the absence of God often is a masked version of his work. Metallurgists know that the only way a metal can be tempered is place it in heat and pressure. That's the only way you can temper metal. And the preparation is essential for the metal to be reliable. And you have to understand, from the perspective of the metal, that's not fun. Stick me in heat, put me under pressure, that's not fun. Guess what? It's what's going to make the metal reliable. Joseph was being prepared to run the entire nation of Egypt. He just didn't know it. He was learning to king it in a hole and learning to king it with prisoners. He just didn't know it. At age 30, Joseph could never have handled the world-class task without an intensive experience and an incredible course in management. So it began in Potiphar's house. He began being a manager there, and he was eventually responsible for all of the affairs of the household. Then he ends up in prison, and he ends up responsible for all of the prisoners. 13 years later, he's put in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Here's the thing. Each one of these tragedies in his life is exactly what he needs, because you don't serve a God who gives you what you want. You serve a God who gives you what is needed to fulfill his story. Now, because God's with us doesn't mean we don't have to be responsible for our own behavior. I want to go back in the story for a minute, because I skipped over 7 to verse 20. You know the story. What does Potiphar's wife do? And we could read it, but you've read it 27 times growing up. What does she do? She falsely accuses him of coming on to her when it's actually the opposite. She hides her own embarrassment, and the embarrassment was not that she came on to him, but that he spurned her. And the problem came without any evil in Joseph's heart at all. I'm reading verses 7 through 9, and I'm telling you there's not a word here that says he did anything to bring this on himself. It came about after these events. His master's wife looked with desire at Joseph. Stop right there. You don't have to be enticing to another person to be enticing to another person. You don't even have to know they're looking. Okay? You can have an entire sin thing going on in your heart and the other person doesn't know and they're sitting right there. They have no idea. Temptation is often not your fault, but your responsibility is always, your response is always your responsibility. And so here's the thing. You can feel tempted to do something. That's when you have to make a choice. I'm not going to do this and I'm not going to think this way. I'm going to change what I'm thinking about. Now, what's interesting is the problem came repeatedly. I think one of the things you have to understand about temptation is it's always your responsibility to respond properly, but temptation is designed to wear you down. That's what this is. That's why it says in verse 10, if you keep reading, it says, she spoke to Joseph day after day. It's designed to wear you down. And the temptation is dangled out there, and maybe she was hoping he'd say, hey, that's kind of neat. You know, I'm really flattered that she's thinking of me that way, whatever. And he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. What's interesting to me is that the problem concluded with the right response, leading to a harsh result in his life. He did absolutely right and got wrong. So now we grow up in our Christian faith and realize I can do right and get wrong, right? Success against temptation doesn't preclude other tests because the enemy has other ways to get us. So what he's doing is the enemy's throwing a temptation right. When that doesn't work, he throws a lie left. Why? Because he's the father of lies. It's what he does. There's very little sin in your life that isn't being played out with several different blows in different directions. Your response is the sin. The temptation is his job. Now, it's interesting to me because his master takes hold of him, throws him in jail in verse 20, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Why did God allow this constant problem to prod Joseph to sin? Why didn't God cut it off? I mean, why didn't God say, you don't get to tempt him anymore? There's only three ways you're going to get tempted: world, flesh, and devil, right? World is going to be all about the people that are around you and the cultural system that you're in. Flesh is going to be all about your flesh is going to want to satisfy things God put within you, but it's going to want to satisfy them in a way that doesn't honor God. Devil, you already got that one. He's just going to dangle it in front of you. The bottom line, why doesn't God do something about that? If God tests Joseph, who is the test designed for? Remember the rule, the test is always for the student. Always for the student. So God never learns anything from a test. So the bottom line here is, I think there's a couple reasons. I think the biggest one is that temptation must be controlled in our lives if God is ever going to entrust to us greater tasks. So you need to be tested on small things before you can be tested on big things. And little private relationships, if compromised, will poison political realities of a nation. This is the tragedy of a president who will have an affair and then lie about it, because the personal moral failings do show up in legislation. It's pretty hard for that president to walk in front of a bunch of teenagers and say, just say no, because he can't. I think it's important that we can't be self-indulgent at every turn and expect God to overlook it. We can't do that. But I also think that God was with him in prison. In fact, God put him in prison. He wasn't there because of himself. God put him in prison. Just as God had put him in Egypt. He didn't get there because he wanted to. God put him there. So virtually, do you see what we're saying? Virtually every uncomfortable circumstance of his life to date, God put him in. Now, what does that do for common Christian theology in a prosperity world? Almost everything he needed was not what he wanted. God was going to bring to pass the dream that he had. His brothers were going to bow down to him, and he was going to save Egypt and Israel. And God had a huge plan for his life, and God could only use him greatly if he could wound him deeply. Just remember, God could only use him greatly if he could wound him deeply. Here's the big problem. I should probably have told you this the first week of class. I didn't. If you want to be used by God, the more you want to be used and the greater you want to be used, the deeper the wound is. That's just the truth. So when you come down to it, I love that God admits his blame in these things. I do. Listen to Psalm 105. He says, Psalm 105:17. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. 105:18. They afflicted his heel with fetters. He himself was laid in irons. Verse 19. Until the time his word came to pass, the word of the Lord tested him. In God's word, God took responsibility for throwing him in jail in Egypt where he didn't want to be. God said, just in case you're wondering, that was me. I did that. Now, what's interesting is, when you take a look at this, anyone you minister to, even if you cannot see, God is working on. I want you to remember, as you sit down with young people and you become someone who would minister to them, anyone you minister to, even if you can't see it, God's at work in them. There are no God-forsaken people. There are people who forsake God, but there are no God-forsaken people. So Joseph saw every situation in life as a new avenue for service. I got to tell you, if there was an ever and always look at the bright side of life, Joe was it. In fact, these kind of people in actual life, can I admit, annoy me. They can manage to get knocked down and go, oh, look how pretty the floor is. Like, that just makes me crazy. Listen to verses 1 to 4. Then it came about after these things, the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was furious with the two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, so he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard in the jail in the same place where Joseph was imprisoned. The captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of them, and he took care of them, and they were in confinement for some time. Then the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt, who were confined in jail, both had a dream the same night, each man with his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning and observed them, behold, they were dejected. He asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in confinement in the master's house, why are your faces so sad today? Now this is one prisoner talking to two other prisoners about how come you're sad. Hello, you're in jail. I'm thinking that might be enough. But no, that's not the point. So verse 8 says, then they said to him, we have had a dream and there is no one to interpret it. You know, I got to give a real hand of response to these guys. You're in jail and your biggest problem is you had a dream that you don't know what it means. I'm thinking that's pretty big of them, because they're probably out there on the rock pile going, I'm so worried about last night's dream. You know, and I'm sitting there thinking, I'm kind of worried about the fact that I'm a prisoner. And then it says, Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? This is something that Joseph assumes, but the men don't know. There's a God in heaven, and he knows what is going on. Why don't you ask him, because he's the one who knows. It's interesting to me that in prison, in Egypt, Joseph still sees God as directly in charge and in control. I want you to mark that in your Bible, because that's the marking of his life. At the end of his life, we're going to see that that's the single thing that gave him hope. The fact that he knew that God is still in control. And it comes right out of his own mouth. Oh, you had a dream? Hey, God knows. And what I cry out for is, Joe, if God knows, why are you a prisoner in a land you don't belong in? Why are you not back with your dress on, back with Daddy? Here's the thing. When I look at these verses, I'm stunned by them. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me, and on the vine there were 3 branches, and it was budding, and the blossoms came out, and the clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took from the grapes and squeezed it into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said, this is the interpretation of it. And then he goes on. Now stop there for a second. Joseph knew that honestly, he needed to remain faithful to what God wanted to do in his life, whether or not things were working out. Even though it didn't seem like he'd be most likely to succeed, he still had a responsibility to follow God. This is a great moment, because there are going to be moments in your life when you're going to go, man, it's just damned if I do, damned if I don't. I can't get a break here. You must conclude that doing what God calls you to do is still the necessary thing. How could God be at work when Joe kept getting shafted by others? His life seems like on an incredible fast track to nowhere. Jim Boyce some years ago wrote a book before he was with the Lord, and he put this passage in it. Just let me read this to you. Billy Graham tells of a friend who went through the Great Depression, losing a job, a fortune, a wife, and a home. He was a believer in Jesus Christ and tenaciously held to his faith, even though he was naturally depressed and cast down by circumstances. One day, in the midst of his depression, he stopped to watch some men doing stonework on a huge church in the city. One was busy chiseling a triangular piece of stone. "What are you doing with that?" he asked. The workman stopped and pointed to a little opening near the top of the spire. "You see that little opening all the way up there near the top?" He said, "Well, I'm shaping this down here so it's going to fit in well up there." And his friend, his eyes filled with tears, because for the first time he recognized that what God was doing in his life was shaping him down here so that it'll fit in up there. I think it's interesting to me that there's a deep lesson here as you pass through the story, that anytime you're following God is not wasted time, no matter what it looks like. It can look like you're not doing anything. Guys, I promise you, if you haven't experienced this yet, you will. One of the things you experience over and over in your life is a sense of significance. Here I am. I'm sitting here on this little sandbar called Florida, and I'm sitting in a room with 20 students, and I love you guys, but I got to tell you, why am I not just out there trying to get the thousands? Why am I not doing that? I don't know if you know this. I know the day God called me to do what I'm doing right now. I was in the middle of Ruth chapter 2 on a stage in front of 5,000 people. I have a recording of it. In the middle of Ruth chapter 2, looking out at that audience, the Lord said, "This is not what I have for you." And I stopped. And there was this unusual pause in my voice, and I know exactly what was going on. I have stood back on that platform many times since, and I remember the day God said, "This isn't what I want you to do." And I knew what he wanted me to do. I knew that what would be more rewarding to me is watching your life. I want you to know that. We're not done this year. I keep watching. It's like you've got a stalker in your life. But see, when Mike Bagby some years ago came to me and said, "What is it you want to do in ministry? What draws you?" I said, "I don't need to be the guy who does it. I just want to be the guy who helps the guy do it." And he said, "Then what you want to do is discipleship and modeling. That's what you want to do." I get more joy out of watching you do it than me do it. I really do. And what I want you to understand is that it can feel insignificant. Anything can feel insignificant. You can talk to people who are on platforms of thousands. One of my good friends pastors 6,500 people. He sat at dinner with me not long ago. He said to me, "It doesn't even matter. Do you understand I'm in a city of 1 million people? I have 6,500 of them. That's not a majority of anything." There he is, 6,500 people. You think he feels significant? He doesn't. There's always a bigger pasture, and there's always a greener, more significant thing. And you could always be a little more famous or more well-known, and you keep getting caught in the trap of my significance comes from fortune, fame, power, pleasure. But wait a minute. Your significance comes from whether or not you can lay your head on your pillow and say, "I did what God told me today." That's it. Why? Because you have no idea what running your pattern meant. You don't know if what he wanted to do was knock the grass down under your feet. So you just do it. I think what's interesting is look at what's happening. You get to 41 and it says, now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. Joseph is used to interpret a baker's dream and a cupbearer's dream. By the way, don't skip the other passage. You know what happened to the cupbearer, right? What happened to the baker? Yeah, things didn't go as well for them. What do you suppose God was training Joseph to do by giving the cupbearer good news and the baker bad news? This is the interactive part, so interact. Say again? Okay, in some ways he's got to take charge, right? He's got to take charge, and that includes something.
Not everything is going to end up good.
Not everything is going to end up good, and you're going to have to be able to say what God says about the good thing and say what God says about the bad thing. There's a whole skill set of learning to say hard things. Let me just stop and say this. Learn to say hard things. If you can't tell people they're lost, you can't tell them how they can be saved. You have to learn to be able to say hard things. And by the way, Elijah's going to learn this lesson. Lots of prophets after him are going to learn this lesson. We're going to come back to that lesson, but let me come back also and say this. Why was one of the two successful? Why did God give him one guy who was going back to work for Pharaoh? He could tell Pharaoh about it, but not on the time schedule that Joseph had given him. Joseph said, when you go back, I only have one thing I'm asking you. Hello, I gave you the message you're getting out of here and gave you the hope that it will carry you through. Could you do me one favor? Could you just let them know out there that I'm down here? And it doesn't happen. God accomplished in Joseph's life victory upon victory, but never directly as a result of Joseph's words. He did it through another avenue. Eventually, it came time, and God gave the cupbearer a memory in front of Pharaoh. So he needed one to die so that he could learn to say hard things. But he needed one to live so that there would be some record of him being down there, right? Now you get to the middle of this, and it says that it happened at the end of 2 full years. Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile, and lo, the Nile came up, from the Nile came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the Nile, ugly and gaunt. And they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek cows. Nasty, zombie-like carnivorous cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. Well, yeah, cows are eating other cows. I think I'd wake up. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. And behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump ears and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke. Yeah, I now have corn, eating corn. At this point, I would not go back to sleep. I would probably get up and walk the floor, warm milk, something. But behold, it was a dream. Now in the morning his spirit was troubled. He sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told him his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. You remember that when you threw me in jail? We had a dream in the same night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now, a Hebrew youth was there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and we related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream, and just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me in my office, but he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. I want you to realize what was going on that morning. Joe got up in charge of whatever prisoners were under his care. He got up and he swept the cell. And he thought, here we go, another day in prison. Maybe I'll go out and break some rocks, you know. Whatever it is they did in prison, I don't even know. But here's the thing. Does anybody think he thought he was going to be in Pharaoh's court standing in front of Pharaoh a few hours later? Because the moment God wants to use your life, he doesn't have to telegraph his punch. That's why the school needs to be in session long before the need is there, because you can't learn it all in the last 2 hours after Pharaoh calls for you. He's got to either have the character or not. So here it is. He sent and called for Joseph. Verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I heard this about you, that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. What is he saying? Yeah, I'm not the one you're asking for. I'm just the vessel of the job. Joseph never thought it was strange that God had endowed him with a gift. He just used it and always knew it was a gift of God. I like that in the very beginning of the passage, in the very beginning of verse 1, it says, now it happened after 2 full years. I want you to consider that. I wrote in my Bible, waiting room. There's a waiting room experience in the Word, and it's built day after day. Noah building day after day while his neighbors are mocking him, and the walk with Abraham through many years between the promise of a child and the birth of Isaac. Day after day waiting for Sarah to have this baby or be pregnant. And Jacob, through 21 years of broken promises. He's 21 years between the time he leaves and the time he comes back. 14 years he's working for some women. 6 years he's having his wages changed 10 times. I think there's a waiting room in Scripture, and I think it just things don't happen in the pace we think they ought to. I think that if you sit with Elijah by a stream and you wait for the ravens to stop bringing you food and the stream dries up, or you cry in prayer with Daniel as the hourglass drops and you're not sure what God is doing, but you're about to face some lions. Or if you walk on a hillside beside John the Baptist as he's led into Machaerus, a prison where he's going to lose his head. Or you sit with Jesus in the Judean desert while the enemy buffets him. It seems to me that God seems constantly to put his treasured people in a waiting room. I think it happens a lot. And I think you should anticipate it's going to happen in your life if you're one of his treasures. Expect that God is going to stick you in a waiting room that's uncomfortable for you. Expect that to happen. And in verse 9, I just made a note that it reminds us that only then, after God interrupted the sleep of Pharaoh, that's when the cupbearer steps out. I want you to understand, this isn't circumstance or coincidence. God gave him the dream. What woke up Pharaoh? God. So God is pulling the strings all this time. So here he is sitting there 2 full years in prison after he's seen his friends go bye-bye. One of them dies, the other one goes back to Pharaoh. Nothing happens. He's in the uncomfortable waiting room. And the whole time this is going on, God is the one who's not acting. It's when God throws the switch and brings Pharaoh into it that everything moves. Your life isn't a series of coincidences. God is at work behind it. And until you understand that, you're going to keep looking at it and going, well, why am I not being promoted? My stinking boss. Can I just make the argument that maybe they are evil? Maybe your boss is really a wretched person. Maybe that's true. Maybe God is saying something. Maybe he's going to throw a switch and you're not ready yet. And you got to get the character stuff worked out before you get thrust into a better position. I think in verse 16, I think it helps me greatly. 41:16. When the ding went off on the oven and God was done with the waiting game for Joe, Joe was fully ready. And he wasn't going to talk big like he did before his brothers. He wasn't going to go down there with, hey, I had this dream and everybody's going to bow down and worship me. Joe's not going to talk like that now. You know what Joe learned in prison? How to shut up. He learned his lesson. In fact, he learned a lot of lessons. So can I stop there and say, next to verse 16, there is no wasted time when you're walking God's way. You're going to go, I've been waiting for, there's a lot of missionaries that have come to me and said, oh, deputation, man, I was 3 years running around trying to raise funds. There is no wasted time walking in God's way. There are no shortcuts, and the road signs are often uncertain, and in the end, He's the only one who knows the way the path leads. By the way, you don't need to know. You don't need to know which way the path is going. You only need to grab His hand and follow Him. That's all you need to do. God is present in any place at any time. He sees any person and He misses nothing. What does that tell you? It tells you that anywhere I go, He's there. Anyone I reach out to, He's working on. Anytime I'm working for Him, He's using me for His glory, even if it doesn't look like it. You can be abducted for 3 years and sit in a prison and be exactly where God wants you to be. How do I know? Joseph, happened. It's already there. Did nothing wrong. Got put on hold.